Hey, you're back, and so are we. This is Billy again with Wolf River Music Television, and like I said last time, this is the last episode about Laurel Canyon. And today, there won't be as much music-related topics to talk about, but really, this one is more about the end of one era and the beginning of a new and a different one. It won't be pretty. And honestly, sometimes big changes in society can be jarring, history can be shocking, and humans can often be downright cruel to one another. But please don't let me scare you away, because there's so much to be learned here. This is episode 7, so let's get started. Right here, 2774 Woodstock Road. We're over on the eastern side of Laurel Canyon now, and as the crow flies, we're less than a third of a mile due west of the final home of Cass Elliot. And we're less than 2/10 of a mile away from the final home of Frank Zappa, which is just to the northeast of here. Now this house behind me was once owned by a young woman. Her name was Abigail Folger. Now that name might ring a bell for you, or it might not. Now Abigail, unfortunately, is one of those rare people who end up becoming more well-known in history based on the circumstances of their death rather than the events of their actual life. She moved here from New York City with her boyfriend, Wojciech Frykowski, and she bought the house in August of 1968. He was a Polish immigrant, a struggling screenwriter, and very new to that industry, but he was also very well connected with some very powerful friends, such as Roman Polanski. And at the time, he was learning to speak better English, being taught by Abigail. She had money, because as the name implies, yes, she was the eldest child of Peter Folger, who was, of course, the CEO and the president of the Folgers Coffee Company. And Abigail was the sole heir to that family's massive fortune. Now, she owned this house for almost exactly 1 year. And then she and Wojciech tragically became 2 of the 7 people, plus an unborn child, who were brutally murdered over the course of 2 consecutive nights in August of 1969 by members of the Manson family. Now, before we just jump right off into the deep end of that quagmire of utter horror, let's take just a moment to talk about both of them as the people that they were, rather than just immediately dwelling on the tragic events that happened to them. First off, also, let me make it very clear. No one was ever murdered here in this house, as far as we know. Those events, as related to them, happened elsewhere. That was in an area about a 15-minute drive to the west of here in Benedict Canyon. Now, more on that exact location later. Abigail Folger and Wojciech Frykowski were well-known members of this community, and they had friends here. They were social people, and they were generally well-liked and respected. So now, unfortunately, is where we come to the part of the story where everything gets real. This is the part where humans become monsters, and the worst nightmares that we could ever imagine become reality. Now, I'm not putting forth any new ideas or any groundbreaking analysis when I say that the Manson murders not only put an end to the extended party atmosphere that was just simply a part of the culture at this time, but they also symbolically brought the entire decade of the 1960s to an abrupt and a screeching halt. And then replaced it with a sense of fear and a completely different outlook on how people felt like they should interact with other people who they don't already know and trust. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now being locked. Neighborhood parties became affairs that were now invite only, and uninvited guests now became highly discouraged because the risk was now just considered to be too high. Most of the higher profile celebrities and musicians who had been living here eventually just started to move away. Why? Because they now wanted to live behind gates that gave them more control over their own personal security. Now others came in, but the older music scene that had once been here took a big hit. Abigail was very good friends with both Michelle Phillips and Cass Elliot of the Mamas and the Papas. Well, of course she was. She was practically a neighbor, and Cass Elliot, as we already know, made it a point to be as friendly as possible with basically everyone she knew. But in a more somber piece of trivia that became known after the investigation of the crime scene at the Tate Polanski house, it was revealed that the very last song that was ever played on a piano by Abigail Folger was one that had been written and recorded by her friends in the Mamas and the Papas. That song was called Straight Shooter. And the reason that it's known to be the last song that was ever played on the piano by Abigail is because the sheet music for the song was still sitting on the piano in the living room at Cielo Drive. Of the 4 people that were present that evening in the house, the only one who was known to read music and play the piano was Abigail. So we thought about going into more details about the events that happened over on Cielo Drive back on the night of August 8th, 1969. But the truth is, we just changed our minds about that for several reasons. First off, while those events were certainly directly related to this area, as we've already discussed with Abigail Folger, we're here to talk about Laurel Canyon, and we want to try to stick with that as much as possible. 2, there's nothing more really that we could possibly add to what's already been scrutinized, analyzed, documented in thousands of papers and articles and books, etc. And it's just really dark and heavy. And if you're interested in the topic, there's plenty of resources out there for you to look up. But I do have to warn you, it's not exactly light reading. So just be prepared for that. Now, if you think you might also have an interest in trying to head over to the Tate Polanski house, which was located at 10050 Cielo Drive, well, then you can just forget about that because it's not even there anymore. The property is still there, of course, and the driveway gate is still in the same place, but even the original address no longer exists. Now that house, which by the way, was an absolutely beautiful European country-style farmhouse, was demolished in 1994, and it was replaced with this gigantic 18,000 square foot monstrosity. They changed the address to 10066 Cielo Drive, probably as a way of just finally erasing the whole stigma of what took place out there. In fact, I know that that's exactly what they wanted to do because the man who had the house designed and built had this to say in 1996. So yeah, it's gone. Gone, but not forgotten. Now, I'm only going to share just a couple of quick stories with you that deal with some of the many encounters that happened out here between certain musicians that we know and the more infamous members of the Manson family that we know. And quite frankly, I have to say that my initial intentions with the creation of this video series were never to highlight anyone who was ever associated with that group of thieves and murderers, and I don't want to glorify any of them. I certainly do not want to glorify any of their actions, which were beyond evil and despicable. Now, the main point that I'm trying to get at by even bringing any of this up at all would be just to show how unavoidable the topic really is. Their presence was here, and it was here often. And this place, Laurel Canyon, for so many reasons, was very alluring to them. And the reasons for that should start to become painfully obvious the more we talk about it. Johnny Echols was one of the co-founders and the lead guitar player for the Laurel Canyon band, Love, that up to this point I have to apologize for, basically for just overlooking them throughout all of this. They were one of the very early successful groups that came out of this area, and I plan to give Love their due just a little bit later on. But for now, Johnny Echols is going to be the subject of an early Manson family encounter. Sometime in early 1968, Johnny and his Love bandmate Brian McLean were living together in a house that had to have been somewhere close to the base of Lookout Mountain, because he claims that Joni Mitchell and Frank Zappa were close neighbors. And of course, we've already become very familiar with that area of the canyon. But as was customary in the pre-Manson days, prior to the murders in August of '69, these guys often left the doors to their house unlocked at all times, even when they were out of town. And all their friends and the friends of their friends were welcome there at any time. That was basically just the vibe. And people around here were very comfortable and very trusting that their houses and their belongings would remain in good hands amongst their friends. When these two returned home from being out of town for a few days working with their band, they came back inside their home to find that there were some familiar people hanging around inside the house. It was really no big deal to them. One of the people present was an old high school friend of Johnny's, and his name was Bobby Beausoleil. Now, if you don't recognize that name, you might recognize this photo. If that still doesn't ring a bell, then let me just tell you that he is still serving his life sentence that was handed down to him in 1969 for the torture and the brutal murder of a music teacher named Gary Hinman, whom he killed with a samurai sword after he was directed to do so by Charles Manson. That was initially a drug deal and a robbery that had gone bad. So yeah, great guy. But the thing was, at this point in time, he hadn't killed or robbed anybody. So he was still just considered an old high school friend. The conversation that happened then at that point between Johnny Echols and his old friend Bobby probably went something a little bit like this. Hey man, welcome back. How's it going? Well, it's all cool, man. Good to see you again. So, who all else is here? Oh, it's just me and some friends in the back, and my girlfriend Sadie needed a place to crash. So I told her that it would be cool if she just crashed in your bed. You don't mind, right? Nah, man, that's cool. Just let me know when she gets up and y'all get ready to split. Right on, man. Thanks. And so, it may have gone something like that, but the end result was that yes, at some point, Bobby's girlfriend, Sadie, did finally sleep off that heroin bender, and she emerged from Johnny's bedroom like an undead ghoul from the pits of hell. And at that point, Johnny was a bit upset because in his words, he described her as a filthy, dirty creature and that she smelled absolutely awful. So this was who was in his bed. So, do you recognize this one? Okay, how about now? So luckily for the rest of us, Bobby's girlfriend Sadie, aka Susan Atkins, died in prison in 2009 at the age of 61. Let's talk some more about one of my more favorite topics, and that would be Frank Zappa. Now, you may recall from an earlier episode that I shared with you a very well-known quote from Mr. Zappa regarding all the nut jobs in California, yada, yada, yada. Okay, and I also said at that time that I believed that there may have been more to that statement than what just appeared on the surface. So, check this out. Another brush with some of the Manson family parishioners also happened in early 1968. And that was again during that very brief time period that Frank Zappa and his wife Gail lived in the old Tom Mix cabin. That's the one that we showed you that had burned down on Halloween Day 1981. Now I also shared with you some of the many stories of just the sheer amount of people and friends and complete strangers who were constantly wanting to be in there or just simply be near that house where Frank Zappa lived. People were either trying to get Frank's attention for business-related conversations, or else they just wanted to hang out with other famous people, try to get loaded without getting kicked out by Frank or Gail, or else they were just drawn like moths to a flame because of all the energy that was being emitted by that place. So on some random evening over at the Zappa house, a group of scraggly-looking freaks and weirdos showed up at the door, which wasn't necessarily such a rare occurrence in that regard, but who exactly it was is really what's more at issue here. Also, why they were there. Who it was, or at least who the de facto leader of this group was, which consisted of a single male and another group of probably 4 or 5 shadowy female figures following closely behind him, was this guy. And who might this gentleman be? Well, that would be none other than Tex Watson. Who's that, you ask? And how do we know it was him? Okay, well, first question first. Tex Watson was widely regarded as Charlie Manson's right-hand man. And old Tex here, who was also widely regarded as pretty much the most brutal and the most dangerous member of the entire Manson drug murder cult. Even the other cult members were afraid of him. So Tex Watson did all of Manson's dirty work without question. And it was Tex who was the one who was always sent out on very specific errands based on Charlie's wishes and his bidding. So when he arrived at Zappa's house with his group in tow, he was recognized by someone else who was already inside the house. And he was identified as someone who was already well known by the crowd who were generally in the business of buying and selling illegal narcotics. In other words, he was a dope dealer, and people were beginning to recognize him as a person who was often seen in the local area. Now, once Gail or Frank would have heard this from a trusted friend, they would have immediately shown this group of uninvited guests straight to the gate and then off the property, telling them to never come back. Because remember, the Zappas didn't play that game, and they did not tolerate it at their place. They were parents, and they were not in the dope business. Now, for the other part of that question, what did they want, and why would they decide to show up at the Zappa's place? Because Frank Zappa did not buy illegal drugs. Now, you always have to remember that other than being the leader of a psychotic cult of brainwashed hippie lunatics, Charles Manson also fancied himself as a legitimate musician. He wrote songs. He played the guitar. He even sang those songs for others whenever anybody else would listen. Sometimes he even managed to sing and play those songs that he wrote to some shockingly big names in the music business, and some of them may have even lived right around here. Charles Manson wanted to break into this Los Angeles music scene in a really bad way. He somehow managed to not only get an audience with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, he even talked Dennis into letting him and about 20 others in his family stay at the house that Wilson owned in Bel Air. And that lasted for quite some time until Dennis Wilson finally had to flee his own house out of fear for his life when things started becoming insane and violent. Manson also got the ear at some point of none other than our own hero, Neil Young. And I have to say that I was actually very disheartened to even hear that he fell for it for a while, until the creep vibe actually finally got his attention and Neil came to his senses about it. Now, I could go on and on about all of the times that this kind of thing happened, but I won't. All right, so here's my theory as to why these Manson family people showed up over at the Zappa's place wanting to get a meeting with Frank. I don't think that this time they were actually there trying to sell drugs to a group of musicians. I think that this trip to Laurel Canyon was because Tex Watson and his entourage were sent here by Manson because he wanted to have a meeting set up between himself and Frank Zappa so that Charlie could play his songs for him. That's what I think. So, here we come back again, full circle, and back to the quote from Frank Zappa. Every single nut job in the state of California has figured out where I live, and they won't stay away. Frank Zappa had a music studio, and he had industry connections that Manson would have definitely been interested in. Zappa also had his own private record label, and was widely known to have signed some pretty odd groups to that label, and also invested money into them in the past. But Frank was smart. He would have never signed Charles Manson to his record label, nor would he have ever even tolerated his presence in his house or in his studio. So that meeting, had it ever actually happened, would have ended pretty badly for Mr. Manson. But based on other certain events that followed, all I can say is this: I'm really glad that Frank Zappa was never faced with the proposition of having to disappoint and or anger Charles Manson by turning him down like this. So, if all of that wasn't enough to brighten up your day, let's fast forward now 12 years into the future, into the year 1981, and let's go take a look at another place that has come to symbolize, in a way, the direction that Laurel Canyon took after its really cool heyday in the late 60s until a bunch of other really stupid shit came in and fucked it all up. So, buckle up, my friends, because this one is going to be a wild ride. Let's head over now to Wonderland Avenue. In the long history of brutal and violent crime that has taken place in the Los Angeles area, there have been a few incidents that have stood out as the most infamous and the most shocking. But the murders that took place right here in Laurel Canyon, and more specifically here in this house on Wonderland Avenue in the summer of 1981, definitely sit right at the very top of that list. While Los Angeles was still reeling from the aftermath of the Manson murders in 1969, it was during this time period of the 1970s and into the early 1980s that big changes were taking place here within the shadowy underworld of the cocaine and heroin distribution networks, including the infiltration of organized crime and drug cartels from South America. And while no one was shocked or surprised to know that narcotics and drugs, much more dangerous than simply marijuana, were being bought and sold in virtually every inner city and suburban neighborhood of the greater Los Angeles metropolitan area, no one here expected something like this to happen in the once peaceful and tranquil, quiet, tree-lined streets of Laurel Canyon. While the Manson murders hit close to home and caused virtually everyone in Los Angeles to reevaluate their own sense of safety and security, it was the Wonderland murders in 1981 that hit directly at the heart of this community and shattered the illusion that something this heinous could just never happen here. Well, it did.